Hello everybody, welcome to Fun with Windows Forms. I'm Jordan Cohen. In today's video, we're going to be introduced to Visual Studio 2015, and we're going to use it to create a simple little project that allows us to both try out certain widgets that you can use to create Windows applications, as well as discussing and taking advantage of the event-driven nature of Windows Forms. This video is intended for my grade 12 students, but anybody is welcome to follow along. You should understand variables, methods, and other basic coding principles before you start. However, no experience in Windows Forms or Visual Studio is required. By the end of this video, you will be able to create a new Windows Forms project. You will have investigated the event-driven nature of Windows Forms, and you will write a method to run when idle, so something that's not event-driven within the event-driven environment. So let's get Visual Studio running and get started. When you come to this beginner screen here, you can click New Project right there on the Start page, or if for some reason the Start page is not up for you, you can go to File and choose New Project. Please make sure that you've chosen Visual C# here when you're choosing your language. Depending on your installation, sometimes Visual Basic will be the default, which means if you click Windows Form Application, you might not notice it says Visual Basic. Make sure you choose Visual C# and Windows Form Application. Otherwise, you'll be very confused as to why your code simply doesn't do this. It doesn't work the same way. We're going to give this a name. I'm going to call it Fun with Forms. It'll take a moment to create the project. Longer, evidently, because I'm recording right now. There we go. Sorry for the delay. And here we are. So let me give you a tour of what we've just come to. This is the page where the screen that we'll be doing most of our work on. On the left here, we have our toolbox. If your toolbox isn't showing, it may just be hidden here in this tab. If you just click on Toolbox and then click on the little push pin, it will automatically keep your toolbox up for you. You probably have common controls open like I do, and you can leave those open because those are going to be the tools that we're going to be working with in this project. Here in the middle is your main working space. Right now we have the Forms Designer showing, so we can see a little window. It looks like a Windows window, and of course that's what we're going to be adding our little widgets to. We could, just to get started, drag this out and make it a little bit bigger. On the right-hand side here, we have our Solution Explorer. This will show you all the assets you currently have in your project. Right now, we have the starter template for a Windows Forms application. However, as you develop your skills in Visual Studio, you'll be adding separate files, separate resources, and they'll all show up in this hierarchy here. Down here, we have our Properties window. This will show you the properties for whatever you have selected. Right now, I have the form itself selected. You can see as evidenced by those dots there. And so I can change things about the background. For example, about the form, I can change, for example, the background. If I change the background color here, I can pick a custom color, a bunch of web-friendly colors. I think there's 256 of them that they have here. Or you can use the system colors, which has to do with your theme. So my theme is the Windows 10 Dark, and I guess these are the colors that go along with that. I'm going to find a nice web color, something soothing here, just maybe some gray in the background to give it some pizzazz, I guess. Here we are. So let's add our first tool. We're going to drag out a button. Now a button is exactly what you think it would be. Make it a little bigger, and I can drag it around. Of course, a button is just something that can be clicked on. By itself, it has no behavior. It doesn't really do anything. Let's say we're going to want 3 of these, so I'm actually going to copy and then paste and then paste. And the reason I like to copy and paste is now all 3 are the same size. So let's lay these out together. Before I give them any functionality though, I don't want them to be called button 1, button 2, and button 3. I want them to be called A, B, and C. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on it. Once it's selected, I can go down here to the Properties window, and there's one property here called Text. I do not want it to say button 1, I want it to say A. However, that's kind of small, especially because I'm just putting one letter, so let's make it a little bit bigger. You can see that font is one of the properties, and it has a little plus box next to it. If I click that plus box, it expands, and now we have the ability to change all sorts of things about the font. I want it to be bold, so I'm going to change bold to true, and I want it to be quite a bit larger than 7.8 size font. I'm going to make it, say, 14. See how that looks. That looks good to me. I can do the same, or sorry, before I continue, let's rename it. So we want to change the name under design. And this is important that we do this step first, because when we start programming functionality to this button, this name is what it's going to be referred to as in our code. So I'm going to call this A button. That's a capital A and a lowercase button. And I'm going to actually rethink my previous attempt. And now that I've made the A button, I'm going to copy that and paste it. And paste it. And the reason I'm doing that is so I don't have to do the same steps twice. I'm just going to change A to B. And of course, I need to change the name of this. I don't want it to be button 1 or A button. I want it to be B button. And finally, we'll go to C. We'll change the text to C and the name to C button. I know that normally you would capitalize the first word of the variable name here, but because I want it to be uppercase C, it would look awkward. So let's just leave it like that. And there we go. We have 3 buttons now. If I click the Start button up here, this will run my program, and we will get our Windows form generated. There it is. And we can click on these buttons. They don't do anything right now, so that's not very exciting, but we can click on it. Okay, so let's close this now, and that should automatically stop it. Brings us back to where we just were. You'll notice that it has exited with code 0. Code 0, if it says the program is exited with code 0, that just basically tells you that your previous execution was successful. So nothing went wrong. It didn't have to stop for an unforeseen reason. All right, let's add our next item here. We're going to add 2 things now. We're going to add a text box. And we're going to add a label. A label is exactly that. It's just text that shows up on here in order to label something. So I want to actually have something next to this text box telling you what it is. I want to say something like your code, because we're going to make a secret code out of A's, B's, and C's. So again, while I have label selected, the properties window becomes the properties of my label. And I want to change the text. So let's scroll up and find text right here. We don't want it to say label 1. We want it to say your code. Move it over so it's not overlapping. And now we're going to change the properties of this text box. Now you may have noticed when I select this text box, I can't drag to make it larger, right? I can move it around. I can't drag to make it larger, and the reason is it wants you to do that through the properties. A text box is a one-line input for text. So just to show you what that means, if I run it right now, I can type something here. And so it's a place where text can be typed. It's a place you could actually lock it so the user can't type it. You can put values there. But it's one line of text. So in order to change the size of it, they don't want you just to drag it. They want you to change the size of the font, and it will fit accordingly. So let's do that. Again, we can expand font here. And we want to change the font size. And let's make this just like we did before, 14. And we'll do the same thing for our label so it doesn't look out of place. And we'll drag it out. Now what I want to make this program do for now is when you click A, I want it to add A to your code here. We can make this longer in this direction. When you type A, I want it to put A here. When you type B, I want it to write B here. And when you type C, I want it to type C here. In order to do that, we're going to need to do 2 things. We're going to need to create a variable to store our value. And we need to create functionality on the 3 buttons so that when they are clicked, they add the correct letter to my code. In order to start coding, you could look over here and try to find the right place, but one easy shortcut, especially when you're getting started, is just double click on the item that you want to create code for. So if I wanted to create code for this button, I would double click on the A button. And now you can see that we have a new tab opened here. It says form1.cs. CS is C#, so this is our code file. This is the design view you can go back to if you need to. But this form1.cs lets us actually click some code. It's a private void method that is generated called a button click. In other words, when you click on the A button. There are two parameters here, which for the time being you can just ignore. The object sender is the object which sent this or which triggered this call, and event args would be the class that contain event data. Event data depends on what you're doing. Later on, you may see some examples where you can get some information out of this using an API to find out information about the system, about what's currently going on, about how you ended up having this method click. But for now, just leave these two parameters here and sort of ignore them. We're going to be writing some nice simple code. In general, when you're looking at Visual Studio, try not to lose focus and look at all this stuff and say, oh, what's all this and what's all that. We'll look through some of the important elements, and the best way to look at this is to figure out where you have to add code to make things happen the way you want, and then figure out the details when you actually need to change something and you are exploring, hey, how would I change the way that text is handled? And when you're on a specific mission, you'll figure out how to change some of these other things. But for now, ignore the text that has nothing to do with what we're working on. So here we are programming our A button click method. When we have A button clicked, we want to change the value of some variable. I need to actually declare that variable. So I'm going to use a string. Now you may notice you get autocomplete in Visual Studio. You can, when something you like is selected, you just hit enter and it'll complete it for you. And we're going to make a string called the text. I'm going to set it equal to nothing, and every time the user clicks the A button, I want to say the text plus equals A. And the other thing we need to do is update our text box. So let's give the text box a name before we can refer to it, or we could check the name. We could use the name that was generated, but that's not good. If you scroll down here, there's the name under design. The name is currently textbox1, and I'm going to call it code text box. That's where our secret code is going to go. So now I can say code, and you'll notice it after I've created that variable, it's right there, ready for me to autocomplete. I want to add A to that as well. I don't have to add A to both. So caps lock, there we go. I don't have to add A to both. I could have just added it to the text box, but I wanted to show you how to create a variable here. So it's a good exercise to do both, and then later on we can use this variable to do things, make changes to it, for example, without affecting the text box. So let's check if that works. We can run our program. Uh-oh, there were build errors. What did I do? Let's cancel that. Let's see if we can find our build error here. Code text box. Oh, sorry. It's I'm missing a parameter here. Dot text. So when you're referring to a text box, it's not just the name of the object. That is, when I say code text box, it's talking about this whole thing, which has all kinds of parameters and all kinds of things you can do with it. It is code text box dot text. Thank you, Mr. Cohen, for making that mistake so that we could all see you correct it. So let's try running it now. And there we go. And if I hit A, the letter A shows up, and it adds the letter A to the existing text. So whatever was there, it said plus equals. So whatever's already there, add the letter A to it. And so far, B and C don't work, but we'll take care of that right now. So there's also a stop button, by the way. You can usually close this window depending on what you're working on. But in case that ever doesn't work for you, or if it seems like it's still running, there's a stop button right up there. So we'll double click on B. Again, it creates a B button click method, and I'm just going to copy and then paste that in there, and we'll change it to B in a second. We'll do the same thing for C, paste that there. So the letters B, and here we've got C and C. And now if we run our program, we can make a code out of the letters A, B, and C. So far, we haven't really done much, but we've learned how to have one thing affect another, and we've had we've seen how to jump into the properties and make some changes. I want to show you one more thing before we're done, and that is where these methods are actually being created and added to this button. So when you first start out, you create stuff like this, but let's say, for example, you hadn't renamed it ahead of time, and then you needed to change the name of this method because maybe you don't want to call this A button anymore. So it's important to sort of know where this is getting created behind the scenes. Over here in our Solution Explorer, we're working on our Form 1 right now. Inside Form 1, there's this thing called Form 1 Designer. And if you double click on that, it will actually open up the code that is generating all of these objects for you. So, and again, it's hiding here. So it says Windows Form Designer generated code. And Windows Form Designer is this. So basically, Windows Form Generator designed code is everything that was generated while you were building stuff here. When you resize something or change its properties, it's actually hiding in this code here. You actually have to click this little plus. You might notice this goes from line 23 to line 108, and that's because they hide all this. But when you open it up, you can actually see the code that creates all of these widgets or pieces in our form. So here is the A button, here is the B button, here is the C button. You can see why giving it a name that isn't, button 1, button 2, button 3 will start to come in handy when you have lots of buttons. And here are all the properties that are set. So we have the font. You see it changed to 14 because we changed it. And right here at the end is where it adds the event handler. And like I said, Windows Forms is event driven. So rather than having a loop where it's waiting and checking things and waiting and checking things and waiting and checking things, when you're working with Windows Forms, that's all sort of taken care of in the background, and your job is to create events. So every time a button is clicked, an event happens. And what this is basically doing is adding a button.click. That is the method we were working on before, a button.click. It's adding it to this button so that when you click this button, an event gets triggered. This is how Visual Studio in Windows Forms works. You define events and everything gets handled by those events. If we scroll down here, we can also see the code for the text box. And finally, for our label, we didn't rename our label because we don't really need to refer to it in code. But if you have lots of labels, especially if you want to ever alter the effects of them, or if you're going to write code for them, you can change this here. Finally, Form 1, our actual form, we didn't change the name of that, and that's a nice thing to do. Why don't we do that now? The reason we want to do that is right now it says Form 1 up here. And if we were going to have multiple forms, if we were going to have, let's say this could open up different windows, we would want them to have their own unique identities. So if we select the form by clicking on the background here, and then we can find under Design, we can find its name. So we will change this to code form. And the text, instead of saying under font here, or sorry, under appearance here, we don't want it to say Form 1 in the top left. We want it to say Fun with Forms. And now you can see up there it says Fun with Forms, and the form itself gets the name give it code form. And if we go back to the designer now, you'll notice that all got changed. So it's a very smart program. It changed the comments for us. It changed this, and it's actually even highlighting the changes that were just made. So this basically is the code that gets generated while you do this. And it's a pretty smart system because this way you can go back and forth between designing stuff. This way you could, for example, let's say you wanted to generate some buttons programmatically. You can see all the code necessary. You could put this in a loop and generate your buttons in a loop if you wanted. Anytime, it's always nice. It's the same thing when you're working in say, Visual Basic for Microsoft Office. If you want to learn how to do something, you just create it in this view, and then all the code is generated for you. You can come here and look at how that is taken care of. The last thing I want to show you in this video is how to make something happen that that isn't a triggered event. We want to add something so that anytime there is not an event going on, we can check for something. In this case, we're going to make an answer to the secret code, and we want to know if they've typed the answer correctly. So let's start by going back to our form1.cs. So this form1 is sort of our main code. It's still called form1 over here, and that's okay. So form1.cs is our project. And basically the main piece of your code until you move beyond and you start designing stuff in multiple sort of in multiple different forms, or if you have a main program backing your forms and the forms just take care of their own little pieces. But for now, everything is going to go in this form 1. So we're going to add a couple of things here. The first thing we're going to do is add a method that will get called whenever the application is idle. We'll call it handle application idle. Now that's not a built-in name. We have to then define it. And just like all those other methods, they're going to get those 2 parameters, which again you don't really need to worry about for now. You just need to make sure they're there, or this won't work. The next thing is make that method get triggered whenever the application is idle. So what we do is we say application. That's Apple. Application dot idle plus equals, so we're adding something to our application idle, and what we want to do is add the method, so handle application idle. Again, doesn't want to autocorrect for me. Application idle. There we go. And now anything that we put in here will automatically get run every time an event is finished. So you click a button, it will do whatever the button tells it to do, and then it will call application idle. And it doesn't get called over and over again, it gets called every time an event is finished. And that's when it says, I'm now idle, what should I do? And that's what we've added to. We've added a method that will get called every time it finds itself idle. And if you select it here, you can see it's that same method. So in this, we want to check if they've entered the secret code. So what we're going to do is we're going to check with an if statement if the variable, so the variable is called the text, dot text, I don't want to make that same mistake again. If the, oh, sorry, we're using a variable. If the text, now in Java you may remember that you need to use dot equals to compare a string to another string or to a string variable. We don't have to do that in C#. So in C# we can just see if they've entered the secret code. And since I like sheep, I'm going to make the code be A. And I don't really like sheep, I just thought it would be a good code. If the text equals ba, then message box dot show you entered the secret code. And let's also say else if the text dot length is greater than 4, then message box dot show wrong. And we don't just want to tell them we're wrong, we also want to reset it for them. So we're going to set both the text to nothing, and we're going to change code text box dot text to nothing. In other words, if they get the code wrong, then we're going to reset it for them. The last thing we're going to do is to avoid this happening over and over and over and over again, we're going to use a Boolean that will only let it happen once. So we're going to make a Boolean called triggered. Now you'll notice that in C#, Boolean is called bool, B-O-O-L. And we're going to set it initially to false. And we're going to say that if they've gotten it right, then we're going to say triggered equals true, so it won't happen again. We're also going to make this a requirement here. And not triggered. Not triggered means the same thing as triggered equals false. Okay, I could write it like that instead. So if the text is ba and it hasn't already said you entered the secret code, then tell them they've entered the secret code. But we don't want to tell them over and over again, because what will actually happen is every time you close this message box that's going to pop up, that's considered an event, and it'll check again if the text is right and make you do it over and over again and get stuck. So we put that in there, and I'm just going to change it back to the other notation because I like it better, and not triggered. All right, let's make sure I didn't make any mistakes. There we go. So if I say BCCC, it says wrong. But if I say BAAA, it says you entered the secret code. Okay, so far so good. That's the end of my first video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Just to quickly recap what we've done today, we've created a new Windows Forms project, we've investigated the event-driven nature of Windows Forms, and we've looked at how to write a method to run when idle. So it is still sort of event-driven, but it is happening regardless of what event happens. It happens at the end of every event, and there it is right there. Handle application idle, which again we added to the idle. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or constructive feedback, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.